I'm 26 and from Virginia. This happened to me last year right after I accepted a job offer in Maryland. It was one of those sudden life shifts where everything lines up so fast you just kind of roll with it. The job was paid decently and I was eager to get out of my parents' house. The problem was, I only had about 2 weeks to find a place before my start date. Rent around Baltimore is ridiculous, especially for somebody just starting out, so I turned to Craigslist even though everybody says not to. I filtered for rooms under $700 a month and came across a listing that felt too good to be true. It was a room in a 3-bedroom house in a quiet suburb outside the city. The photos showed a clean space, nice kitchen, hardwood floors, decent-sized bedroom, and a window overlooking the backyard. The rent was $550, all utilities included. The ad said the landlord was quiet, respectable, and looking for somebody clean and employed. I emailed, and about an hour later, I got a response from somebody named Gregg. He said the room was still available, and asked if I could come by that evening. We arranged a time, and I drove over after work. The house was a modest 2-story, tucked off the main road, a little run down but nothing terrible. The lawn was overgrown and there were no cars in the driveway. I remember thinking that it was odd that a 3-bedroom house didn't have more signs of life. Gregg answered the door. He was a tall, maybe early 40s, pale, skinny guy to the point of looking frail. He had this smile that made me feel uneasy, but he was polite, soft-spoken, and showed me around without any pressure. The house looked just like the photos, if a bit emptier, no clutter, barely any furniture. The other 2 bedrooms were spoken for, Gregg said, but the roommates kept to themselves and worked nights. I didn't see either of them during my visit. It wasn't perfect, but it was clean, cheap, and move-in ready. He said I could even pay week to week to start with. I signed a basic agreement and moved in 2 days later with just a mattress, a desk, and some clothes. If I'd have known what was truly going on, or that Gregg himself was a lie, I would never have set foot in that house. The first few days were quiet, too quiet. I never saw the other roommates, not even once. I asked Gregg about them and he just said that they worked opposite hours. He wasn't wrong, their doors were always closed and I'd hear faint movement at weird hours like 3 or 4 AM. Sometimes a door creaked open or the bathroom light switched on. I figured they were night shift nurses or something. But then I started noticing things. The house always smelled faintly of bleach, like someone had just cleaned something. Not the kitchen or the bathroom, those always stayed dusty and barely touched. It was more like that strong lingering chemical smell that you'd get if somebody dumped a whole bottle of it down the drain. Not only that, there was a padlock on the basement door on the ground floor hallway. Gregg told me early on not to worry about it, just storage, he said. I accepted that, but sometimes when I got up to grab water at night, I'd swear I hear things down there. Not like machinery or pipes, more like scraping or dragging. I tried brushing it off, maybe one of the roommates was working down there with metal or something, or maybe there were just rats. Maybe it was an old furnace. Looking back, I missed these red flags completely. Then one night, about 4 days in, I heard something that I just couldn't explain away. It was around 2 AM and I'd been up late watching something on my laptop. Just as I was dozing off, I heard footsteps, heavy ones, going down the stairs towards the basement. They were too slow and too deliberate to be somebody just grabbing something, so I stayed still listening. Then I heard what sounded like muffled yelling. Not words, just distress, then a loud thud, and then a second one, and then silence. I sat up with my heart pounding and opened my door just a crack. The hallway was dark, and Gregg's bedroom door was closed. I crept downstairs, something wasn't right, and I needed to check. This time the basement door was closed, but the padlock was hanging open. I stood there for maybe 5 minutes trying to convince myself I hadn't heard what I thought I'd heard. I eventually went back to bed and didn't sleep much. In the morning, the basement door was locked again, and the bleach smell was stronger than usual. Over the next few days, more weird things started adding up. My food would disappear from the fridge, specific things like sandwich meat or fruit. Once I came back from work and my door was cracked open. Nothing was missing from my room, but it definitely hadn't been that way when I left. Then one night I came home and heard voices from the living room, Gregg and somebody else. I was relieved. I was actually going to meet one of the roommates. But when I rounded the corner, Gregg was alone, standing in front of the TV talking to it while it was turned off. I froze. He didn't notice me at first, he just kept mumbling something like, "They don't see, they don't see." Then he turned his head just slightly and said, "Oh, you're home early." His voice was too calm. I made some excuse about needing to pick something up and went straight to my room. I locked the door and shoved a chair under the handle and started seriously reconsidering whether I should stay in this house. I should have trusted my gut, because things were about to get much worse. That night I couldn't sleep. I lay there listening to the creaks and the groans of the old house. Around 3 AM I heard it again, Gregg's voice, low, talking to somebody. Then the sound of something being dragged. This time I had to know. I got up quietly, opened my door and crept down the hallway and down the stairs. The basement door was open, just slightly. I could hear Gregg down there, not talking now, just breathing, heavily. I should have left. I should have packed a bag and gone to a motel or something, but I needed proof that I wasn't losing my mind. I pulled out my phone and turned on the camera and started recording as I pushed the basement door open. The smell hit me immediately and I almost couldn't stand it. It wasn't bleach, it was something worse. Sour and metallic mixed with sweat and feces. Something was really wrong. I stepped down a few more stairs, trying not to make a sound. The light was on below, but I couldn't see the full room yet, but I could hear Gregg mumbling and cursing under his breath. Then I heard a voice, not Gregg's voice, a woman's voice, weak, whimpering and barely audible, saying, "Please, please." The shock of hearing a woman made my foot hit the step wrongly and it creaked, loudly. Gregg snapped around the corner at the bottom of the stairs. His face was pale, his eyes were wild and wide. He started up the stairs fast, faster than I thought he could move. I could see the anger in his eyes and it was clear to me that his intention was to harm me. I bolted back up, slammed the basement door shut and ran to my room, knowing that the front door was probably locked. I then climbed out the window onto the porch roof, dropped down barefoot and ran a block before calling 911. The police turned up about half an hour after I called. I explained everything that I'd seen and showed them the footage on my phone, which prompted them to conduct a search. What they found in the basement still makes my stomach turn. There was a woman, and it wasn't some random missing woman. It was Gregg's elderly mother. She was tied to a metal chair, bruised, malnourished, and barely responsive. She'd been held down there for at least 2 weeks. It turns out Gregg didn't own the house. His mother did. She was the real homeowner, but he'd been trying to rent rooms out behind her back after she apparently refused to move out or sell. When she stood in his way, he locked her in the basement and started posing as the landlord. The roommates, they were just part of the lie, they never existed. They were meant to make the place seem more lived in and normal. He used them as a smokescreen so nobody would ask too many questions. If I knocked on one of their doors, he could just say that they were sleeping, working, or gone for the weekend. Later, the police told me that Gregg had a record in another state. Nothing major, some fraud, trespassing charges, but enough to raise eyebrows. He'd also been squatting in vacant properties before, but this time he'd crossed a line, a big one. And if I hadn't escaped when I did, I don't know how far he would have gone. He knew I was asking questions, and he knew I was getting suspicious. And when somebody like that starts to feel cornered, who knows what they're capable of? I still think about it, about how close this poor mother was from never walking out of that house, about what would have happened if I hadn't come home early that night, or if I hadn't heard that voice. People always say to trust your gut, and now I understand why. There were signs, the smell, the quiet, the strange behaviour, but I was so focused on saving money, getting out on my own, that I ignored all of that. I live now with friends, people I actually know, and I don't look at Craigslist anymore, not for anything. So everybody out there reading this story, stay safe out there. I don't usually go for Craigslist deals, especially not the ones that sound too good to be true. But a few years ago I was in a tight spot. I needed a car, something cheap, reliable, not too flashy. After weeks of browsing listings and hitting dead ends, I finally found something that seemed promising. The ad was for a 2009 silver Toyota. Clean interior, decent mileage, and listed at just over $2,000. The pictures looked normal, nothing fancy, but they weren't sketchy either. The car was photographed in a gravel driveway, surrounded by what looked like a tree line and a few shrubs. Pretty standard. The ad included a phone number which somehow made it feel more legitimate. I called it early that afternoon. A man picked up. He sounded quiet, a little older, maybe in his late 40s I guessed. His voice was calm, almost too calm. I told him I was interested in the car, and he told me that someone else had reached out already today, but if I could get there within an hour or two, I could see it first. That seemed fair enough, and when I asked for the address, he gave it without hesitation. But there was something off about his tone. It was polite, but it was hollow. The way he repeated things, the slight delay before answering, like he had to remind himself of what to say. Part of me felt like I should hang up, but I talked myself out of it. I figured maybe he was just old or socially awkward or maybe just bad with phones. Looking back, I should have trusted my gut, but in fairness, how was I to know what was about to happen? He gave me an address about 45 minutes outside of town, out past Quakerton. Mostly farmland and wooded areas. Nothing out of the ordinary for Pennsylvania. The roads would be quiet with minimal traffic. I wasn't thrilled about going out there alone, so I asked my friend Adam to come along. He was bored anyway, and we figured that we'd make a day out of it, grab some food, check out the car, and maybe spend the rest of the day relaxing or even hitting up a few friends on the way back. As we drove out there, the roads got narrower, the houses got more spread out, fields, hedges, and patches of woods just took over. I remember the signal on my phone dropping about halfway out there. Adam cracked a few jokes, stuff about how this was how horror movies started, and how we'd probably end up in a ditch or worse. I laughed it off, but I also couldn't shake the weird feeling. Maybe it was the silence of the place, or maybe the fact that we hadn't seen another car for maybe 20 minutes. Eventually we reached the turnoff that apparently led to this guy's place. It was a narrow dirt track, barely wide enough for my car. It looked like it hadn't been used in a week. There was grass growing between the tyre marks, trees lined both sides, arching over like a tunnel. We followed it for a few hundred yards until the house came into view. To say the place looked rough would have been a major understatement. A large weathered two-storey wooden country house, covered in faded paint, patches of rot. The roof sagged slightly on one side, and a front window had a curtain blowing outward through the crack in a pane. The garage was attached to the side of the house, but the door was warped and off its hinges. Surrounding the property were dozens of old cars, bits of machinery and tooling, making the place look like a scrapyard. The house itself didn't look abandoned, but it definitely hadn't been properly lived in for a while. It just looked sketchy. I double-checked the address, it matched. Adam looked at me and said something about how this couldn't be right. There was no car in sight that looked remotely like the one we'd seen in the listing. And there wasn't even a driveway that looked remotely like the one that was on the listing either. I said that maybe the car was in the garage as we both stepped out of my mum's car. Just then, a man's voice called out from the open window. He told us to come round through the side door and said that he'd be with us in a minute. He sounded like the guy on the phone, calm, quiet, but something about the delivery made my stomach tighten. Something about that open window just felt way too convenient. Still, we walked around the side of the house. The kitchen door was half open, swinging slightly in the breeze. As we stepped closer, I noticed deep scratches along the wooden frame, like somebody had tried to force it open with a crowbar. When we stepped inside, the room was dark. Dim light filtered through a dirty window over the sink, and the air smelled like mildew and something sour, like garbage left out too long in the heat. I called out saying that we were here for the car, but nobody responded. So we stepped inside. The kitchen was a total mess, with plates, bowls, and cutlery stacked everywhere. The floorboards were rotting and exposed. Calling out, we carried on deeper into the house. We moved through to what we assumed was the dining room. Still, there was no sign of the man. That's when we heard the voice again, but this time it was deeper, slower. It came from further inside the house, and it was telling us to come just a little bit further into the next room. We could hear that there was somebody literally just around the corner, but we couldn't see them. There was a pause between us. Adam looked at me and whispered that this felt wrong, something was really wrong. The voice didn't sound like the one we'd heard outside. It was heavier and more deliberate, almost like somebody trying to mimic somebody else's voice and coax us inside, but it was failing to hide the effort. I agreed with Adam. We turned back towards the kitchen, deciding that we were done. As we stepped back out into the sunlight, I looked towards the garage, and that's when I saw somebody. A man in a green hoodie and jeans, probably mid-40s, was darting around towards the side of the garage. He didn't see us at first, but when he did, he ducked his head behind and rushed inside. His movements were twitchy and quick, like he was caught off guard. That moment was enough. We bolted. I unlocked the car with shaking fingers and jumped in. Adam got in just behind me, and I threw the car into reverse before we even had our seatbelts on. We didn't say anything until we were several minutes back down the road. Adam broke the silence first. He pointed out again that the driveway from the listing didn't match what we'd seen. The background on the Craigslist photos had clearly shown neat gravel and trees that weren't there. Even the lighting had seemed too perfect. It was like the pictures had been taken from somewhere else entirely. Once we had proper signal again, I tried to reload the ad, and instead I just got an error 404. I called the number, but it was disconnected. That's when we realised that we'd been lucky and missed something truly sinister. About a week later, I decided to drive past the area again, just out of curiosity. I found the road, but the dirt track had been blocked off by a rusted gate, and the mailbox at the entrance had been smashed to pieces. There was no sign of anyone living there, no car, no lights, nothing. I still think about that day sometimes, about how close we came to walking deeper into that house, about that second voice, how it didn't feel right and how it felt staged, like somebody was waiting behind that hallway. Like it wasn't a car ad at all. It was bait. And if we hadn't trusted our instincts, if we hadn't seen that man rush into the garage, I honestly don't know if we'd have made it back into the car. Sometimes I wonder if someone else did go further inside, someone more trusting, someone alone. And I wonder if anyone ever heard from them again. A few years ago, I moved into a small apartment just outside of San Diego. I was living on a tight budget and trying to furnish the place without spending too much, so I did what a lot of people do, and I turned to Craigslist. Most of the stuff I got came from college students moving out or people upgrading their furniture. I never had an issue, but one listing sticks with me, and not in a good way. Someone had posted "free couch, must pick up today" as a listing. The photos looked decent, big, grey, kind of modern, the kind of thing you'd see at IKEA. The description said that it had barely been used and needed to go because the owners were leaving town unexpectedly. It sounded like a great deal. Looking back, I don't know what I was expecting, but it definitely wasn't what I found. That couch was never free. I just didn't realise the price until it was too late. I texted the number in the listing and I got a reply straight away. The person, who said their name was Rob, gave me an address about 30 minutes away in a more rural area. He said the couch was in a garage and that I could just come by and take it. He said he'd leave it open. I borrowed my mum's car and headed off. The journey took me about 35 minutes to get to the house. There was a long driveway and a small detached garage as promised. The garage door was open. No one was around, there was no cars in the driveway, no noise, just silence and that dry late afternoon heat. Everything about the place felt like it had been abandoned, except for the light in the garage. It was like somebody was waiting for me to walk in. I parked up and walked over to the garage. The couch was there, exactly like in the pictures, but it was covered in a dusty tarp. And that's when I noticed something weird. The tarp had these dark smudges on it like oil or grease. I figured maybe they'd been there moving stuff around and spilled something on it. I pulled it off halfway and touched the cushions. They were damp, not soaking wet but not dry either. Kind of sticky, like they'd been sprayed with something. The couch itself didn't look anything like the one in the pictures, and that piqued my interest. It started to feel like something was wrong. And then I saw it. There was a camera, a small black lens wired into the corner of the garage wall, tucked into the beam above the couch. At first I thought that maybe it was a motion sensor or a light or an old security camera, but this one looked new. It had a faint red glow. I backed up a little and that's when I noticed something else. There was no other furniture in the garage, no tools, no storage boxes, just the couch. Like somebody had cleared the whole space just for this setup. That creeping feeling stayed in my chest, like I'd walked into a room that had been waiting for me, but not for the reason I expected. I texted Rob. "Hey, I'm here in the garage. Is it cool if I take the couch?" Nothing. A minute passed and then he replied, "Yeah, just take it. Don't worry about anything else." The phrasing threw me off. Don't worry about anything else. I hadn't mentioned anything else. Something about that line really messed with me, like he knew I'd seen the camera, like he was watching me right then. I bent down to grab one end and started lifting, and that's when I heard footsteps behind me, fast. I turned around and two guys were standing in the garage doorway, hoodies on. One of them had something in his hand. It looked like a crowbar or a pipe, I couldn't tell. But before I could react, one of them said, "Drop it, give us everything." I froze. "Your wallet, your keys, your phone, now." I didn't even argue. There was nowhere for me to run and I was completely alone. I just held out my stuff. My heart was pounding so loud I could barely hear them telling me to take off my backpack and leave it too. They didn't raise their voices. That was the scariest part. It was as though they'd done this before, like they weren't worried about anything going wrong. After they took everything, the guy with the pipe patted me down and checked for anything else and said, "Now walk off. Don't turn around." I walked down the driveway and onto the dirt road. I kept walking for almost a mile until I saw a house with a porch light on and knocked. The older man who answered called the police right away. I sat on his porch shaking while I gave them the address and told them what happened. The call handler explained that she'd send a unit down. Whilst I waited, I asked the guy about the house I'd just come from. He explained that it hadn't been lived in for a while since the previous owner died, but that he had seen other cars going up its driveway recently. The cops arrived about 30 minutes after I called. They interviewed me in more detail, asking what happened and if I needed a ride home. I waited at the older guy's house while they searched the property I'd been robbed at. Sure enough, they found nothing and no one, just the garage and the couch. When I got home later that night after my roommate picked me up from the police station, I checked the Craigslist again. The listing was gone. It had just disappeared. That was the last time I'd ever used Craigslist. I waited for a few weeks, hoping something might turn up, but there were never any arrests and nothing was ever recovered, and there was certainly no trace of the perpetrators. What gets me the most is how planned it all felt, like the couch wasn't even real, it was just the bait. Something about how quiet the house was and how fast those guys came out, how they knew I'd be there alone and how they knew when to strike. And I still think about what would have happened if I'd refused to hand over my stuff, if I'd tried to fight or run. That couch cost me a phone, a wallet, and a sense of safety that I'll never get back.